year was 1840. Georgia's summer heat hung heavy in the air, draped over the land like an invisible curtain, pressing down on every soul who walked its red clay roads. The cotton fields shimmered in the sun, endless rows of white bolls swaying gently, hiding within them a truth that was anything but gentle. To the traveler's eye, the landscape appeared rich, prosperous, and serene. But beneath the surface, beneath the manicured lawns and the proud, white-pillared mansions, was a system of cruelty, humiliation, and secrets whispered only in the darkest of corners. This was the world of the plantations, vast estates that were the pride of the southern elite, and the graveyards of countless hopes for those enslaved. Within their boundaries, the men and women who labored in the sweltering heat did not own their lives. They were bought, sold, and traded like livestock. Families were torn apart, mothers separated from children, husbands ripped away from wives, all at the whim of those who called themselves masters and mistresses. In the middle of this cruel order stood one plantation, perhaps more elegant than most, perhaps more terrifying than all: Magnolia Plantation. Its sprawling grounds seemed almost unreal, like a picture in a painting. From afar, its towering oaks, their branches heavy with Spanish moss, looked like guardians of wealth and stability. The white mansion at its heart stood in pristine beauty, every window polished, every step swept clean. To visitors, it was a house of refinement, a mark of southern grace. But to those who lived under its shadow, Magnolia was a prison cloaked in lace. And at the center of Magnolia's story was its mistress, a woman of status, a woman of elegance, a woman whose name carried weight in every parlor room, whispered with admiration among some and suspicion among others. She had inherited wealth, but what she inherited most of all was power. Power over the land, power over her neighbors, and, most disturbingly, power over every enslaved man and woman who dared to breathe within her property lines. Yet her rule was not like that of most planters. Her cruelty carried a different shape, a darker hunger, a secret so unspeakable that even those who knew of it struggled to form the words. Slavery was already a system of absolute domination, but what she imposed was something else, something more personal, more twisted. At the time, whispers spread quietly, never in open daylight. They drifted like smoke in the slave quarters, carried in frightened tones at night when the overseer's footsteps had faded into silence. Whispers of what happened behind the locked doors of the mistress's private chambers. Whispers of men called upon, not to work the fields, not to haul cotton, but to serve in another way. Whispers of shame and humiliation, of men who entered her presence and emerged broken, never to speak of what had been done to them. The white neighbors who came to Magnolia for tea or Sunday gatherings suspected nothing, or perhaps chose to see nothing. To them, the mistress was simply a widow, maintaining her estate with dignity and grace, commanding respect where many women were denied it. But the enslaved knew another story, a story so dark it barely seemed believable, a story that blurred the line between rumor and reality. Georgia in 1840 was a land where men often took what they wanted from enslaved women without hesitation, without punishment, without guilt. That cruelty was common, almost expected. But what made Magnolia's mistress infamous, what made her name echo through the fields and into the fearful minds of her slaves, was that she reversed the order. She did what society did not speak of, what no one dared to imagine. She sought out the enslaved men, not as laborers, but as victims of her control. It was said that before any man was sold from Magnolia, he was first brought into her chamber. There she tested him, inspected him, claimed him in ways unthinkable. For her, it was a ritual of dominance. For them, it was a nightmare that lived in silence, a humiliation they carried long after they were sold. No plantation owner would ever speak of it openly. No records remain in ledgers or estate papers. But the whispers, those low, trembling whispers, survived. Passed down, retold, carried like poison in memory. And through them, the story of Magnolia's mistress remains, buried beneath the official histories but alive in the shadows of the past. Tonight, we enter those shadows. Tonight, we step into a story the polite world of the South tried to bury. A story whispered in fear and disgust, a story that speaks not only of slavery's brutality, but of the scandalous sins hidden within its system. This is not the tale of a master. This is the tale of a mistress, and her secrets were darker than anyone dared to imagine. What happened inside the Magnolia Plantation was more than cruelty. It was obsession. It was scandal. It was sin that even the cruelest of slaveholders would not speak of aloud. And as her actions spiraled, so too did the consequences. For in a world already built on silence, her crimes were too heavy to remain forever hidden. The story you are about to hear is not found in textbooks. It is not the polished version of plantation life that Southern families passed down with pride. This is the story whispered in the shadows, murmured by those who had survived, feared by those who might inherit the truth. And it begins, as all dark secrets do, with the image of perfection, a grand plantation, a wealthy woman, and the lies that protected her. Magnolia Plantation was beautiful in daylight, but when night fell, and the windows of its great house glowed faintly with candlelight, that beauty gave way to dread, for it was then that the mistress began her rituals. It was then that the slaves trembled, hoping not to hear their names called. It was then that the true nature of Magnolia revealed itself. This is the opening shadow of her story. A story of domination, humiliation, and scandal so powerful, it shook the very foundations of Southern society. And in the next chapter, you will meet her, not as a rumor, not as a whisper, but as a woman of flesh and blood, a woman who played the role of elegance in public and predator in private. She was known in Georgia's circles as a woman of refinement, a widow who carried herself with dignity, and one of the few who managed to maintain her plantation without the direct guidance of a man. Society admired her strength, whispered about her beauty, and envied the wealth she commanded. But admiration in the parlor room and fear in the slave quarters were two very different things. Her name was spoken with care, with a kind of uneasy respect. The neighbors called her the Mistress of Magnolia, as if the title itself belonged to legend rather than reality. She was elegant, always dressed in silks and lace, her hair arranged meticulously, her voice calm and measured in public. But for those who lived under her command, there was nothing calm about her presence. Her footsteps echoed in the halls of the great house like a warning. Her gaze could silence a room, and when she called a name, no one dared to resist. The plantation itself was a reflection of her. Magnolia sprawled across hundreds of acres, fields of cotton stretching out toward the horizon, barns and slave quarters dotting the land like scars on an otherwise picturesque painting. Visitors saw only the beauty. The long drive lined with oaks, the carefully kept gardens, the white mansion with its towering columns. But those who lived in its shadow saw something else entirely. They saw the cruelty woven into every blade of grass, every lash of the overseer's whip, every order barked under the southern sun. Yet Magnolia's cruelty had a face, and that face belonged to her. Unlike many widows of the time, she did not remarry. Some said she enjoyed her independence too much. Others whispered that no man could tolerate her sharp tongue, her sharp mind, or her sharper hunger for control. Whatever the reason, Magnolia belonged solely to her, and through it she exercised a power few women in the South ever dared to grasp. Her reputation among the elite was complicated. Women praised her hosting, her charity donations to the church, and her ability to maintain Magnolia's fortune without male guidance. Men, however, carried quieter suspicions. Some envied her success. Others muttered that she had grown unnatural in her authority. A woman in charge unsettled the carefully built order of Southern society, and perhaps they were right to be unsettled. For behind the polished exterior of the Magnolia mistress lay a cruelty more sinister than that of her male counterparts. She did not simply command labor in the fields. She commanded bodies in the shadows. Her relationship with the enslaved men was not one of distant ownership, but of immediate and personal domination. Those who worked the cotton rows felt her influence most at night. When the day's labor was finished and the overseer's whip no longer cracked, another fear settled over the quarters. The sound of footsteps on gravel, the sight of a house servant carrying a lantern, the dreaded call of a name. It all meant the same thing. A man was being summoned to the big house, summoned not to rest, not to eat, not to serve at table, but to face the mistress herself. In public she spoke of order, discipline, and the natural hierarchy of the South. In private she exercised a darker hierarchy, one in which humiliation was as powerful a tool as the whip. Men dreaded her summons, for what happened in those chambers was not simply abuse. It was a stripping away of dignity, of manhood, of humanity itself. The Magnolia Mistress believed herself untouchable. In her mind, the plantation was her kingdom, and she its sovereign. To her peers, she appeared as a strong woman maintaining her family's fortune. To the enslaved, she was something far more terrifying than any overseer. She had the law on her side, the church's silence at her back, and the wealth to smother any rumor before it grew too loud. But rumors did grow. In the fields, in the slave quarters, in the kitchens and back rooms, whispers spread. Whispers that the mistress of Magnolia was unlike any other. That she did not simply control her slaves, she consumed them in ways no one dared to speak of in the open air. These whispers clung to Magnolia like a shadow, unseen by polite society, but impossible to ignore for those trapped within its walls. It is here, in the figure of this woman, that our story begins to take its full shape. She was not just a widow, not just a plantation mistress, but a figure of scandal waiting to explode. For while the South could ignore the sins of its men, the sins of a woman, especially a woman in power, would not remain hidden forever. And so, Magnolia Plantation stood as both a jewel of Southern pride and a cage of Southern shame. Its mistress ruled with a hand far more dangerous than a whip. Her elegance, her wealth, and her influence concealed a darkness that would one day undo her entirely. For now, she believed herself untouchable. She believed her secret safe, but behind closed doors, power has a way of writing its own testimony. And what happened behind the locked doors of the Magnolia Mistress's chambers would soon become the most whispered scandal in Georgia's history. The Magnolia Mansion was a masterpiece of Southern architecture. Wide porches, tall columns, polished floors that reflected the glow of chandeliers. But for the enslaved men who lived in its shadow, it was not a place of beauty. It was a place of fear. By day, the great house bustled with activity. Servants carried trays of food, polished silver, and cleaned rooms that seemed too large for any one person to occupy. Visitors admired the paintings, the velvet drapes, the imported china. But once the guests were gone, once the lamps burned lower and the cicadas began their endless chorus outside, the house changed. Its silence became heavy, oppressive, and it was then that the true power of Magnolia revealed itself. Behind closed doors, the mistress reigned supreme. Her authority stretched beyond the fields, beyond the ledgers of sales, beyond the accounts of cotton bales. It reached into the very souls of the men who served her. Unlike the overseer's whip, which left marks upon the skin, her power left wounds that could not be seen but never healed. The summons always came the same way. A trusted servant, often trembling, carrying a lantern into the slave quarters. A name would be called. No explanation was given. No refusal was permitted. To resist was to invite punishment harsher than the body could bear. The chosen man would rise slowly, sometimes shaking, sometimes silent, and follow the glow of the lantern back to the house that loomed like a ghost in the darkness. Inside, the mistress awaited. Sometimes she sat at a desk, pretending to review papers. Other times she reclined upon a chair, her expression calm, as though she were about to discuss something ordinary. But nothing that happened beyond those doors was ordinary. She would look at the man with eyes that saw not a human being, but property. Property she intended to use as she pleased. Rumors spread among the enslaved that she had a ritual, that she believed herself entitled to inspect every man before he was sold. To her it was a form of judgment. She decided who was fit, who was worthy, who was strong. But in truth it was less about judgment and more about domination. She relished in the humiliation, in the fear that spread like wildfire when her lantern-bearer appeared in the quarters at night. The men who entered her chamber rarely spoke afterward. They carried themselves differently, heads lowered, eyes clouded, voices quieter than before. Some refused to speak at all, burying the memory so deep it could not be reached. Others warned the younger men in hushed tones, "Pray she doesn't call your name." Even the overseers, hardened men accustomed to cruelty, avoided speaking of it. They knew something happened behind those doors, something that went beyond the accepted practices of the South. For though the society of 1840 turned a blind eye to the violations committed by male masters, a mistress's appetite was considered an abomination. Yet as long as it remained hidden, no one interfered. Wealth had a way of silencing questions. For the enslaved, however, silence did not mean peace. The weight of what happened inside the house poisoned the quarters like a sickness. Fear clung to every corner. Each night brought the possibility of another summons. Each sunrise left behind another man who carried shame like a brand upon his soul. It was not only the act itself that broke them. It was the knowledge that they had no power, no escape, no defense. Their bodies were not their own. Their dignity was stripped away in a way the whip could not achieve. And the mistress knew this. She thrived upon it. To her, every encounter was not just an indulgence, but a demonstration of her supremacy. She was not merely the owner of land and slaves. She was the ultimate arbiter of control. The irony was thick. Society praised her as a woman of refinement, of restraint, of elegance. But the enslaved men of Magnolia knew a different truth. They knew that the mistress who smiled politely at church was the same woman whose shadow haunted them at night. And so the rumors grew. Men who had been sold from Magnolia carried whispers with them to new plantations. Whispers of what the Magnolia mistress did, whispers that could never be spoken in daylight, but were repeated in hushed tones around fires, in back rooms and in fields. Each man who left carried the story further, until Magnolia's name was stained in ways polite society refused to acknowledge. Yet, for all the fear, for all the brokenness, there was always the unspoken question, what truly happened in those rooms? No one dared to describe it in detail, not even among themselves. Perhaps it was too painful, perhaps too dangerous, or perhaps the shame was too heavy to share. But one thing was certain. The mistress's chambers were a place where dignity was destroyed and silence was born. This was power in its most twisted form. Not the power of money, not the power of the whip, but the power to erase a man's sense of self, to turn him into nothing more than an object for her private rituals. And though she believed herself untouchable, though she carried her secret behind gilded doors and polished windows, power has a way of leaking into the world. Secrets, no matter how dark, never stay hidden forever. The Magnolia mistress had created a world within her house that was darker than the fields outside, but even she could not control the whispers forever, for behind every closed door, there comes a moment when silence begins to crack. For most enslaved men at Magnolia, the summons to the great house felt like a death sentence. It was not death of the body, but death of dignity, slow, suffocating, and permanent. They feared the sound of their name spoken by the house servant at night because it meant only one thing: the mistress had chosen. Her chambers were prepared with unsettling precision. Candles flickered against velvet curtains, casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. The air carried the faint smell of perfume, a sweetness that clung to the skin long after the night had ended. To her, this setting was part of the ritual. To the enslaved men, it was a prison dressed in elegance. When a man entered, the mistress studied him carefully, as if he were merchandise displayed for inspection. Every glance was calculated, every word meant to remind him that he was not human in her eyes, but property, her property. She insisted on silence. She demanded obedience. The smallest hesitation, the faintest sign of resistance, brought punishment swift and severe. In her twisted mind, these encounters were not simply acts of indulgence. They were tests. She convinced herself that before she sold a man, she must measure his worth, not only in strength and stamina, but in submission. If he yielded without question, she considered him broken and therefore easy to market. If he resisted, even slightly, she saw it as defiance to be crushed, or as proof he could fetch a higher price, having survived her control. The men who endured this ritual rarely spoke of what was done to them. Their silence was not weakness, it was survival. To confess was to risk punishment. To share details was to relive humiliation. Instead, they carried it like an invisible chain, heavier than any shackle on their wrists. In the quarters, whispers described the ritual in fragments. Some said she forced men to stand before her, stripped of their pride, while she mocked their bodies and their manhood. Others whispered that she demanded acts meant only to break their spirit, forcing them into positions that left them shamed and powerless. No matter the detail, the result was the same. A man left her chambers hollow, his eyes darker than before, his voice quieter, his back bent under a burden no lash had delivered. What made her ritual so chilling was not just what happened, but how deliberate it was. She did not act in passion or impulse. She acted with calculation, as though domination itself was a ceremony she could perfect. To her, each man was a subject in a performance only she controlled. To them, each night was another scar written on their soul. And yet, despite the fear, despite the shame, despite the unbearable silence, these stories spread. They spread through the fields across the plantations, carried by those sold from Magnolia into new chains elsewhere. Enslaved men whispered of her ritual like a warning, a curse that followed them long after her reach. But the mistress did not fear whispers. She believed herself protected by wealth, by status, by the silence of a society that would never believe such rumors about a woman of her stature. After all, the South turned away from the daily violence of slavery. What difference would a few whispers make? Still, the enslaved knew better. They knew that one day, silence could no longer hold back the weight of such darkness. They knew that power built on humiliation had cracks, and that even the wealthiest mistress could not bury her sins forever. For now, though, Magnolia remained her kingdom. Each ritual was another reminder that the men had no control over their bodies, no claim to their dignity, no shield against her will. The overseer's whip taught them fear of pain. Her ritual taught them fear of themselves, that even their manhood, their very identity, could be stripped away at her command. One young man, chosen after years of watching others suffer, was said to have wept silently through the night. Not because of the pain, but because of the shame. When he was sold weeks later, he carried that shame with him, warning others in whispered tones of the mistress's ritual. Another, stronger in spirit, emerged with eyes full of rage, but he too was silenced, sold far away before his anger could take root. And so, the cycle continued. Men summoned, dignity broken, silence enforced. Each ritual strengthened her illusion of control. Each night made her believe more firmly that she was untouchable. But power built on submission is fragile. It breeds resentment, it festers in silence, and it waits, quietly, patiently, for the moment when one person dares to resist. For the Magnolia mistress, that moment was still to come. For now, her rituals continued, cloaked in candlelight and secrecy, hidden from the world yet etched into the souls of those who endured them. Every plantation had its cruelties. Every slaveholder had sins. But Magnolia's mistress had built something darker, a shadowy kingdom of ritual humiliation that no ledger, no church sermon, no polite conversation could erase. The enslaved knew it. The whispers carried it. The shadows guarded it. And soon, the first cracks in her power would begin to show. The ritual might have been hidden behind the heavy doors of the mistress's chambers, but its effects walked openly among the enslaved. Men who entered her room returned changed, quiet, hollow, carrying shadows in their eyes. They spoke little, but their silence told its own story. At first, the quarters spoke only in fragments. A man would sit by the fire after the fields, staring into the flames longer than he should, and someone would whisper. He was called to the big house. Another would limp the next day, not from the overseer's whip, but from something unspoken, and a woman would murmur, "She broke him." These whispers grew soft and dangerous. In a world where survival meant silence, speaking of the mistress was like playing with fire. But the enslaved needed to understand the danger among them. And so the whispers spread, not in open conversation, but in coded words exchanged in the fields, behind the smoke of cooking fires, in hurried breaths before sleep. Some told of humiliation too deep to describe. One man, older and worn from years of labor, confessed in secret that the mistress made him kneel like a dog before dismissing him. Another, barely more than a boy, said she touched him as if testing livestock, laughing at his shame. These stories were carried from man to man, woman to woman, their details twisting and shifting like smoke. But one truth remained. No one wanted to be called into that room. Fear gave the whispers strength. Mothers warned their sons to keep their eyes low, to draw no attention, to work harder than the others if it meant avoiding her gaze. Fathers prayed quietly that their boys would be spared. The younger women, themselves victims of the white men's power, understood too well the silent suffering written on the men's faces. They offered comfort where they could, but comfort could not erase the wounds carved by her ritual. Soon, these stories traveled farther than Magnolia. Slaves sold away carried them into new fields and new quarters. On neighboring plantations, men spoke in hushed tones of the woman in Magnolia who broke men before selling them. They spoke of her beauty, her wealth, her cruelty, and of the humiliation she demanded behind closed doors. The overseers and traders ignored the whispers at first. To them, slaves talked endlessly, and their words held no weight. But there was something different about these murmurs, something that lingered. Men arrived at auction silent, withdrawn, broken in spirit. They were strong in body, but their eyes told of nights that had stripped them of pride. Buyers noticed but said nothing, chalking it up to Magnolia's reputation for obedient stock. Within Magnolia itself, whispers became warnings. When the mistress's servant came to the quarters at night, men shifted nervously. Some offered to take another's place, hoping to protect a brother, a cousin, a son. Others tried to hide in the shadows, though hiding never saved anyone for long. The mistress chose whom she wished, and the chosen obeyed. The women whispered too. They whispered of how white men's sins were expected, how masters took what they wanted from enslaved women every day without consequence. But when a woman of power committed the same acts, it was something unnatural, something more dangerous. They said the mistress's rituals cursed not only the men, but the land itself, that Magnolia's soil was fed not just by sweat, but by shame. Despite the fear, the whispers gave the enslaved a kind of strength. They shared their pain quietly, binding their suffering together into something larger than themselves. Each story, each fragment, each warning became part of a secret history the mistress could never erase. They could not fight her openly, but they could remember, and remembering was its own act of resistance. In time, even the white folks began to hear. How slaves carried gossip between families, passing hints through kitchens and parlors. Magnolia's men come to market too quiet. One cook whispered in another's ear. They say the mistress keeps secrets in her chambers. These fragments reached traders, overseers, even preachers who visited Magnolia's chapel. None dared confront her directly, but the rumor began to settle in the shadows of southern society. The mistress herself noticed the change. She saw the way her slaves avoided her gaze more than before, the way they trembled at her summons. But she mistook this for proof of her power, not the spreading of whispers. To her, silence was victory. She did not realize that silence was also survival, and survival often meant the truth would outlive the fear. One night, as the enslaved gathered quietly in their quarters, an elder spoke words that lingered in the hearts of all who heard. He said, "The whip marks fade, the body heals, but what she does, that stays here." He pressed his hand to his chest, "And here." He touched his head, "And it follows us when we leave this place. That's her true chain." The fire cracked, the children leaned against their mothers, and the men sat in silence. They all knew the elder spoke truth. The mistress was not simply their owner, she was their shadow, her rituals staining not only their present but their future, and still the whispers spread. They slipped through Magnolia's gates, across fields and rivers, through auctions and markets. With each retelling, the story of the mistress grew darker, her reputation whispered in corners where polite society dared not tread. The enslaved did not need to speak loudly. Their whispers carried enough weight to echo far beyond the quarters. Soon, those whispers would reach ears that could no longer ignore them. The South in 1840 prided itself on its rigid order. Men ruled plantations, women presided over households, and enslaved people were expected to remain voiceless, bound by chains both physical and invisible. Yet beneath that carefully polished surface, secrets rotted like wood eaten through by termites. Magnolia Plantation was one of those polished facades, grand, beautiful, but hollow with corruption. And the whispers that began among the enslaved had now begun seeping into the parlors, church pews, and supper tables of Southern society. At first, it was no more than gossip traded between plantation wives. One might lean in after Sunday service, lowering her voice so the preacher would not hear. "They say she treats her men differently." Not like stock, but like... The other would hush her quickly, scandal flashing in her eyes. Even to speak of such things was dangerous. Yet the thrill of forbidden talk was too tempting to resist. Among men, the tone was different. White planters often bragged openly of their conquests over enslaved women, boasting as if such violations were marks of power. But when the subject of the Magnolia Mistress arose, their voices tightened. To them, her behavior was unnatural, an inversion of the hierarchy they lived by. It was expected that men took what they wanted. But a woman, that was an abomination, and so while they hid their own sins behind silence, they whispered hers with sharpened tongues. Rumors circulated that her slaves arrived at auction not merely obedient but broken, eyes lowered not in respect but in shame. Traders noticed but spoke only in quiet circles. A preacher's wife repeated what she'd overheard to a neighbor, and soon Magnolia's reputation began to stain the very air around it. Southern society thrived on appearances. A lady's virtue was her currency, her weapon her crown. To host dinners, to keep a polished home, to walk into church draped in silks, this was the armor that protected women of wealth. But if even the faintest shadow of scandal touched that armor, it shattered. And with every whisper, Magnolia's mistress felt the cracks forming. She tried to maintain her position. She attended church with her head held high, her lace gloves perfect, her parasol shielding her face from the sun. She smiled at the other ladies, spoke of the weather, donated generously to the parish. But she felt the weight of their glances, quick, darting, questioning. She noticed when conversations hushed as she entered. She recognized the subtle cruelty of polite society. A smile that lingered too long, a laugh that held a hidden edge. Even the men grew wary. Those who once admired her wealth and independence now avoided her gaze. Some mocked her behind closed doors, calling her the Mistress of Magnolia, with tones that dripped with both envy and disdain. Others feared her, whispering that a woman who could bend enslaved men to her will was dangerous, unpredictable, perhaps even cursed. Yet, for all the whispers, no one confronted her directly. In the South, men's abuses were tolerated, but a woman's scandal was more complicated. To expose her would also expose the hypocrisy of a society built on exploitation. Better to let the whispers circulate in silence than risk tearing down the fragile illusions that held their world together. Still, the pressure mounted. A visiting preacher, troubled by rumors, preached one Sunday on the unnatural sins of women who forget their place. His words carried no names, but every ear in the church turned, however briefly, toward Magnolia's mistress. Her face remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but inside her chest, her heart pounded like a drum. The enslaved noticed the change as well. They saw the mistress tighten her grip, demanding more obedience, punishing small infractions with unusual severity. Fear of exposure sharpened her cruelty. She believed that if she ruled harder, the whispers would vanish. But power cannot silence truth. It only feeds it. Behind closed doors of other plantations, families debated. Some women pitied her, others despised her. Some men joked crudely, while others warned each other not to let their wives visit Magnolia too often. Her name became a shadow that followed conversations, always implied, rarely spoken. And yet the most telling change came in the markets. Traders began to speak more carefully when offering Magnolia's slaves. Buyers asked subtle questions, their voices dipped low. This one from Magnolia? He's quiet, isn't he? Heard they come that way. The traders would chuckle uneasily, deflecting, but the damage was done. Magnolia's name had become a warning. The mistress could feel her world shrinking. Where once she had moved freely in circles of wealth and influence, she now walked among eyes that judged, lips that whispered, hearts that condemned her in silence. And though she would not admit it, she knew the truth. Society could forgive many sins, but not hers, because hers was not merely an act of cruelty. It was a crime against the order of things, against the hierarchy that placed men above women, masters above slaves. By asserting her own twisted dominance, she had shaken the fragile structure that held the South together. And society, no matter how hypocritical, would not allow that to stand forever. Magnolia stood tall, its columns gleaming white in the sun, its fields stretching wide, its wealth undeniable. But within its walls, the air was heavy with whispers. Whispers that had slipped beyond the quarters, beyond the gates, into the parlors and pulpits of Georgia, and whispers once loosed cannot be recalled. The mistress of Magnolia had always believed her power absolute. For years, she summoned men into her chamber one after another, and none had dared resist. They might have trembled, they might have broken, but they obeyed. Fear was her weapon, silence her shield. But every chain, no matter how heavy, strains under pressure. And in the summer of 1840 that chain snapped. It began on a humid night, when the cicadas screamed in the dark and the fields lay heavy with the scent of cut cane. Her servant had come, as always, to the quarters. He carried the same message he had carried countless times before. The mistress wished to see a man in the big house. This time, her choice fell upon a tall young worker named Elijah. Elijah was not the strongest man on the plantation, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that set him apart. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was steady. The others respected him, though they knew respect could not shield him from the mistress's call. When her servant spoke his name, the quarters fell silent. Elijah stood slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the dirt floor. For a long moment he did not move. The servant shifted uncomfortably. Finally Elijah said, in a voice barely louder than the wind, "Tell her I won't come." The words hung in the air like a spark above dry grass. The servant stared at him, horrified. No one had ever said no, no one. Refusing the mistress was refusing the very order of Magnolia. To disobey meant punishment, perhaps death, but Elijah's gaze did not waver. His shoulders were stiff, his fists clenched. He had lived with fear all his life, but tonight something inside him refused to bow. The servant, terrified of delivering such defiance, begged him, "Don't make me tell her. She'll kill you." "You don't understand," but Elijah only shook his head. "I do understand. Too well." When the mistress heard, her fury was volcanic. Never before had anyone denied her. She paced her chamber like a caged animal, her silk skirt snapping against her legs, her face flushed with rage. For her, it was not merely defiance, it was betrayal, humiliation, a crack in the illusion of control she had so carefully built. She ordered Elijah dragged to the big house. The overseer complied, his whip at the ready. Elijah did not fight, though his silence was louder than any scream. They threw him before her, his back bloodied, his hands bound. The mistress demanded he kneel. Elijah lifted his chin and refused. She struck him across the face with her gloved hand, her voice shrill with anger. "You will do as I say." But Elijah's eyes burned with something she had never seen before, not fear, not shame, but defiance. His voice was steady when he said, "You may own my body, but you'll never own me." Those words shattered her composure. In that moment she saw not a slave but a man who denied her power, and that she could not bear. The punishment that followed was brutal. The overseer's whip tore across Elijah's back until flesh split and blood soaked the floor. The other slaves, forced to watch, stood in horrified silence. The mistress believed that by breaking him publicly, she would restore her control. But she misunderstood the nature of power, because though Elijah's body broke, his spirit did not. Even as he fell to the ground, he whispered words the others would never forget. "She cannot take everything." The overseer silenced him with another lash, but the damage was already done. His defiance became legend among the quarters. For the first time, the enslaved saw proof that the mistress could be challenged. Even in defeat, Elijah's stand was a victory of the spirit. The mistress, however, was blind to this. In her mind, she had crushed rebellion. She believed the sight of Elijah's broken body would instill fear in the others, bind their tongues, silence their whispers. But she was wrong. His courage lit a spark that fear could not extinguish. The whispers now carried a new tone. They spoke not only of shame and humiliation, but of defiance. Mothers whispered his words to their children at night. She cannot take everything. Men repeated them in the fields, letting the phrase pass from mouth to mouth like a secret prayer. Even the women, long resigned to silence, felt a stirring of hope. Elijah's refusal marked a turning point. It revealed what the mistress feared most, that her power, built on silence and obedience, was fragile. One man's courage had cracked her illusion, and cracks once formed only grow wider. Southern society would soon hear of this act, though in their version the story would be twisted. Some would say Elijah tried to attack her, others that he was simply rebellious, unruly. But among the enslaved, the truth was clear. Elijah had refused her, and in doing so, he had shown them all that resistance, however small, was possible. The mistress tried to erase him, selling him off to another plantation soon after, sending him away as if distance could erase memory. But memory is not so easily sold. His story stayed behind, carried in whispers that grew louder with each passing day, and so Magnolia entered a new stage of unrest. The mistress had tried to tighten her grip, but the more she squeezed, the more the truth slipped through her fingers. Elijah's defiance marked the beginning of her downfall. Secrets can only live in the dark for so long. Magnolia's mistress had ruled with silence, with whispers, with the certainty that no one would ever dare speak openly of what she did. But Elijah's refusal had changed the air on the plantation. His words lingered even after his body was gone, carried like embers that smoldered quietly, waiting for a breath of wind. That wind was coming. Not long after Elijah was sold away, strange ripples began to reach beyond Magnolia's gates. At the local market, traders noticed the odd stillness of Magnolia's men. One buyer remarked, "It's as though they've been broken in spirit before the auction." The words were meant casually, but another trader leaned closer and asked, "Have you heard what they say about her? The mistress?" It began as half-jokes, muttered after too much whiskey, but each retelling grew sharper. "She tests them before she sells them," one man claimed. Another laughed nervously. "Test them how?" The answer was always whispered, the kind of thing that men repeated only when certain no one else could hear. Meanwhile, in Magnolia's chapel, the preacher noticed the peculiar unease among the enslaved. Their eyes avoided the mistress, their voices carried attention in hymns. Whispers had reached even him, and though he could not name them from the pulpit, his sermons began to sharpen. He spoke of unnatural lusts, of women who abandon virtue, of sins that poison the land. Each word struck the mistress like a hidden blade. But the scandal might still have remained, rumor had it not been for a letter. The story goes that a young enslaved man, sold from Magnolia to a nearby plantation, confided in his new master's house slave. He described the chamber, the humiliation, the ritual she demanded before he was sold away. That house slave carried the story to another, and eventually it reached the ears of a white overseer who hated Magnolia's mistress for personal reasons. He wrote an anonymous letter to a rival plantation owner, eager to see her fall. The letter was crude, filled with venom, but its accusations were clear. Magnolia's lady forced herself upon enslaved men before sale. The rival seized the opportunity. He repeated the claims in whispers at taverns, letting the rumor crawl into the ears of traders, preachers, and society wives. Soon, the scandal was no longer confined to the quarters or whispered in markets. It had begun to circle openly in the social circles of Georgia's elite. Magnolia's mistress felt the shift like a storm brewing. Invitations to dinners grew fewer. The wives who once smiled at her now looked through her as if she were invisible. Men who had courted her approval kept their distance. She could see it in their eyes. They knew. At first she tried to fight back. She tightened her grip on the plantation, demanding strict obedience, lashing out at the smallest defiance. She spent lavishly on church donations, hoping piety might shield her. She even attempted to charm her way back into society with grand gatherings. But the halls that once filled with guests now echoed with emptiness. Magnolia's splendor could not mask its mistress's taint. And then came the preacher. One Sunday morning, his sermon turned sharper than ever before. He thundered against a Jezebel who disguises herself as a lady, who feeds her desires with the souls of men. The congregation shifted uneasily. Though he never named her, every ear in that chapel knew who he meant. The mistress sat rigid, her hands white around her lace gloves, her face pale as marble. When she rose to leave, the silence was deafening. No one offered her a hand, no one bowed. Even her fellow ladies turned their eyes away. In that moment, her isolation became undeniable. But it was not only society that condemned her. The enslaved too sensed a change. For years they had whispered quietly, fearful of punishment. Now, emboldened by Elijah's defiance and by the rumors spreading beyond the plantation, they began to speak more freely among themselves. They told the truth in their quarters without lowering their voices quite so much. They knew the walls of Magnolia were cracking, and they wanted the world to see inside. The mistress, once untouchable, was now a subject of scandal. She could not control the story anymore. Her silence had been her weapon, but now the whispers were louder than her commands. The final blow came when another letter surfaced, this one from a trader. He described in detail the broken state of Magnolia's men at auction, their eyes hollow, their shame too heavy to ignore. He did not accuse outright, but his words confirmed what society already believed. By the time the letter circulated through Georgia's planter class, her fate was sealed. Magnolia's grandeur had become a prison. The mistress wandered its halls, hearing the echo of her own footsteps, knowing that beyond her gates, people spoke her name with disgust. She had thought herself untouchable. Now she was a scandal, a curse whispered in every corner of the South. Her secret, once locked behind closed doors, had spilled into the open, and like blood on white linen, it could not be washed away. Magnolia had once stood as a symbol of wealth, beauty, and power. Travelers passing through Georgia would slow their carriages just to glimpse the sprawling fields, the grand columns of the house, the carefully manicured gardens that whispered of aristocracy. But now, Magnolia's mistress moved through those same halls like a ghost haunting her own home. Her downfall did not come suddenly, though it may have seemed that way to outsiders. It began with whispers, then sharpened into accusations, and finally settled as truth in the minds of society. What mattered was not whether every detail was correct. What mattered was that they believed it. The plantation economy was built not only on crops but on reputation. A mistress tainted by scandal meant a plantation tainted as well. No one wanted to buy Magnolia's cotton at market if it meant aligning with her name. Creditors grew wary. Neighbors withdrew support. The once endless flow of money and influence began to dry up, leaving Magnolia's wealth cracking like paint in the summer heat. But the harshest blow came from her own peers. Women who had once envied her now ridiculed her. In parlors across the South, they repeated the scandal with feigned disgust, secretly savoring every sordid detail. "Imagine," one said, fanning herself, "a woman behaving like that with slaves." Another gasped dramatically, "It's unthinkable." A disgrace to her family name. Yet beneath the outrage there was delight. A rival had fallen, and her ruin made their own virtue shine brighter. At social gatherings, her absence became more noticeable than her presence. Invitations ceased to arrive, and when she attempted to appear, conversation halted the moment she entered a room. Some men smirked. Others looked away, ashamed to even be seen acknowledging her. Her beauty, once her weapon, had become a curse. Every glance at her face reminded them of the scandal attached to it. The preacher's sermons only deepened her ruin. Each Sunday the congregation waited eagerly to hear what new condemnation he would hurl. He compared her to Jezebel, to Delilah, to every woman in Scripture who had lured men into sin. Though he never dared speak her name, his words painted her face so vividly in the minds of his listeners that there was no need. Even her servants, once forced to lower their eyes in deference, now looked at her with something like pity. Or worse, contempt. Within the plantation itself, authority slipped from her grasp. The enslaved no longer trembled at her footsteps. They obeyed, yes, but without fear. A dangerous shift had occurred. The fear that had once bound Magnolia together had begun to unravel. And without fear, there could be rebellion. The financial pressure tightened. Creditors demanded payment. Merchants refused to extend further credit. Her family's name, once powerful enough to shield her, now carried the stench of disgrace. Brothers and cousins who might have supported her stayed silent, unwilling to be dragged down by her shame. Letters from relatives arrived with careful politeness, but carried a cold undercurrent. Distance. She was alone. But perhaps the cruelest punishment of all was the silence that surrounded her in public. Society had a way of killing without striking. When she entered a shop, the ladies whispered behind their gloves. When she tried to speak at gatherings, conversations shifted, leaving her words to die unheard. When she walked through town, even children sensed something unclean about her, shrinking back as if scandal could be caught like a disease. Her rage turned inward. She struck out at her slaves more often, demanding impossible tasks, punishing small mistakes with fury. Yet even this offered no relief. Each act of cruelty was met not with fear, but with quiet endurance. The walls seemed to close in on her. The halls of Magnolia, once filled with music and laughter, now echoed with emptiness. One night, desperate for some sense of control, she attempted another ritual in her chamber. She called for a young man from the quarters, her voice trembling with command. But when he stood before her, his eyes did not lower. He looked at her with quiet defiance, the same look Elijah had once given her. In that gaze was the knowledge that she no longer held true power. She dismissed him with a trembling hand, realizing the ritual no longer bound anyone to her. It only revealed her desperation. As weeks turned into months, Magnolia began to wither. The gardens grew wild, the paint on the shutters peeled, the once proud plantation sagged under neglect. Guests no longer came. Laughter no longer echoed through its halls. The mistress herself moved like a shadow, shunned by the very society she once ruled. The final humiliation came during a grand ball in Savannah. Though she had not been invited, she forced her way there, determined to remind them who she was. She arrived in a gown of pale silk, jewels glittering at her throat, her posture proud as ever. For a moment the room fell silent, but then, instead of respect, a ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut her. No one spoke to her. No one asked her to dance. She stood alone in the center of the glittering room, her beauty on display yet stripped of meaning. At last, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking like hammers against the polished floor, each step echoing her ruin. By the time she returned to Magnolia that night, she knew the truth. She was no longer the mistress of society, nor even of her own plantation. She was a fallen woman, her name etched forever in scandal. Magnolia still stood, but its mistress had already fallen. History has a way of choosing what to remember and what to bury. In Georgia, 1840, the scandal of Magnolia's mistress spread like wildfire in whispers. Yet when the smoke cleared, much of it was silenced. The South was good at hiding its sins, but sins never truly vanish. They linger in the soil, in the stories passed down quietly, in the scars carried by those who lived them. For the enslaved community, her downfall was not an end, but a strange kind of release. The quarters buzzed with cautious relief, for her power had weakened, though none dared celebrate too openly. Men who had been forced through her rituals carried the weight of shame, a shame that was never theirs to bear. Some spoke of it in hushed voices, only to those they trusted most. Others buried it so deep that even their children would never know, but silence does not mean healing. Silence can be another form of chains. Many enslaved men grew hardened, their trust shattered, their manhood mocked by a mistress who saw them as less than human. Some wives noticed the distance in their husbands' eyes, a distance born from humiliation they could not share. Others carried the secret like a wound, passed quietly from one generation to the next. And what of the woman herself? In her final years, she became a ghost of her former self. Magnolia Plantation decayed around her, its walls peeling, its gardens overrun with weeds. Servants did their duties with mechanical silence, no longer bound by fear but by necessity. When she walked the halls, her steps echoed against emptiness, each creak of the wood reminding her of what had been lost. They said she died alone in that house. Her name erased from polite society, her legacy whispered only as a cautionary tale. No mourners filled the pews at her funeral. The church bells tolled, yes, but more out of duty than grief. Some neighbors attended for appearances, but few shed tears. She was remembered less for her wealth and beauty, and more for the darkness she had unleashed. The land itself seemed to hold her memory. Field hands swore that Magnolia's grand chambers echoed with footsteps at night, the sound of a woman pacing endlessly, trapped in her own shame. Some claimed to see her figure in the windows when the moon was high, her face pale, watching over a plantation that no longer thrived. Her ghost became a story told among the enslaved, an omen, a warning, a reminder that even the mighty can fall. Yet beyond the ghost stories, the deeper legacy lived in silence. Historians rarely recorded such scandals, especially when they involved women of high birth. The South could not afford to tarnish its image with tales of a mistress abusing her slaves. Instead, Magnolia's story was quietly folded away, dismissed as rumor, buried beneath the weight of respectable history. What remained were fragments, letters half-burned, testimonies whispered but never written, and the ache of memory carried by those who survived. Still, the truth has a way of enduring. For every history book that left her out, there were the descendants of the enslaved who remembered. They did not always tell the details, but they knew. They felt it in the mistrust of power, in the warnings passed from father to son, mother to daughter. Be careful of those who smile while holding chains. The lesson was etched into their lives. And what does her story tell us today? That power corrupts not only men but women as well. That cruelty wears many faces. That society often condemns women more harshly than men, not because their sins are worse, but because they dare to defy the roles assigned to them. Plantation men who abused their slaves were rarely judged, but a woman who crossed that line, she became an outrage, a scandal, a living threat to the fragile order of the South. In that sense, her story reveals more about her society than it does about her alone. A society that thrived on exploitation but could not face itself. A society that excused male cruelty but recoiled when a woman mirrored it. A society that silenced the voices of the enslaved, erasing their trauma while preserving its own false image of nobility. Magnolia still stands today, though altered by time. The house may be restored, the paint fresh, the gardens tamed once more. Tourists may walk through its halls, marveling at the architecture, the wealth, the history. But the true history is not in the marble floors or the grand staircase. It is in the walls that once heard screams. It is in the fields that once bent the backs of men and women. It is in the silence that still hangs heavy, as if waiting for someone to finally speak the truth. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not what happened in Magnolia's chambers, but that it was almost lost to history. Buried under denial, softened into rumor, dismissed as too shameful to record. But darkness does not vanish when hidden. It lingers, waiting. So we tell the story now, not to glorify her, but to remember those she tried to break. To give voice to the whispers that were once silenced. To remind ourselves that power, when unchecked, can turn even beauty into horror. Her name may be forgotten, but her shadow remains. It lingers in the soil of Georgia, in the echoes of Magnolia's halls, in the broken trust passed down through generations. A warning, a lesson, a secret pulled from the past. The South wanted her story buried. But history has a way of speaking, even from the grave, and sometimes the darkest secrets are the ones we must remember most.